And I want to go outside for a walk. So we're going to get this out of my head. I don't know if I need... Okay. Nope, this way. It's that dyslexic beauty coming in. You know what? I don't think I need this anymore. So I just got done talking about naming and why it matters, how it, a bad naming convention from an atomic sense all the way from a templated sense, and we really can use those words abstractly if we want to, across fields, across conversations and contexts, but if it's broken, it's going to cause destruction somewhere. So ultimately, good naming builds trust.
Take out the trash cans.
Thank you, Alexa. I have to take out my trash. So, oh man, that was funny. Totally. I have ADHD too, so it really did just make my mind go outside. I totally want to get in the sun. If we don't have good naming, architecture breaks down. It breaks down trust in an organization. It breaks down trust with people building the software. It breaks down trust with users using the software. It breaks things down and it makes things not work. Okay? So ultimately, that is emotional in a sense, but there is a hard-driven process that comes out of it, and we get alignment there. Okay? And that's really getting that is what gets us the name. You don't just name things and call it something and then let it drive. You should define it. We define language. Somebody long, long ago came up with the meaning for all the words that we have today. And with technological innovation, it's quickly becoming where words are more and more subjective. Okay? And when it comes to code, we all know that variables, etc., exist, and that those two parallels are coming together right now. And right now, it's manifesting out there in the world. So how do we get through this process? How do we name things? How do we identify where there are issues? There are many, many ways that you can do things. We all have a tool belt. That's what I call it. In my career, I feel like I've just been learning lots of different things and putting them in my pocket and learning when and where I can grab them or multiple and use them to help me create something or define something or figure something out. I think that's the art of problem solving, is using the tools, whatever that you have around you, even if it's nothing, okay? Because something exists all of the time. We just have to be able to see it. And I will talk more about that when we get into research, especially generative research, when it comes to maybe defining a product or defining a feature for a product or working through some sort of issue or usability issue, especially when we don't have resources. A lot of organizations or maybe leaders, or again, I'm not trying to pin it on anybody, but when it comes to capital versus, the code infrastructure or building something, right? Something's going to, drive the need to put something out very quickly. So ultimately, that can lead to this fallback of, well, we don't have resources to do, X, Y, and Z types of research or testing, or theorizing. I say that you do, and it's just about how creative you are, and again, what you know that you have around you. And that really brings me into process. What's process? Again, you can have whatever type of process you want. This is my little basement office, by the way. The backs, I'm still, this is going to be a wait, that's my exercise equipment. Where am I? My desk. Might as well show around. Okay. I'm not used to using all of these things at once, okay. And then we got my whiteboard that I'm building. I had to take a break. I moved again. I've got hey, well started building this thing. I'm going to call it, hopefully I get it right, I'm going to call it a whackboard because I have a bunch of like magnetic blackboard stuff I'm going to put over here. I've got something there right now, but there we go. Yeah, so this is all going to be hopefully blackboard very, very soon. But for now, I just need space to think with my environment so that I can talk about process. And see, it's 7:35. Maybe we'll just make this like 10 to 15 minutes, hopefully. I honestly, I'm not a linear thinker, reader. I very much see things across just planes and plateaus existing all at once. And honestly, when it does come to language or words or even, a script, if you will, it's not, it's difficult for me unless it's like, okay, you have to do this, fine, let's do it. But when it comes to thinking and talking about things like process, well, if I'm seeing across plateaus, it's very difficult for me to just, sit there and try to bullet list something, without space to think, literal space to write it out, because my lists don't go like this. They connect across planes and spectrums. But this to me really is where UX, so let's see. I'm always thinking about people. I'll just say I grew up in a, untraditional home environment, and I had a lot of stuff to work through for a long period of time in my life. And so, firstly, I spent quite a lot of time alone and, spending time doing internal reflection. But what that's also resulted in is just, I think a lot about the internal world of not only myself, but of everyone around me and of all existence. Why is everything there? What does it mean? And how are people perceiving it? And I didn't know that I was always kind of doing UX in a sense, while I was thinking through things that way. And when it comes down to process, even when it comes in terms of code, an engineer knows that you always need to know the foundation of why something exists, so that when you want to build and expand on it, it's going to work. You're not going to break your code. Design is the same, but design because of, whatever. Again, I suppose I can make a mental note to talk about that as like the timeline of design and even just the subjectivity and the version of it and how it's changed over time. But, in terms of visual design and what we can see and do, on our computer screens, it's behind, in a sense, if you will, code. Code had to come first, and these things have to catch up. And, especially with trying to catch up with mimicking the real world, that's going to take some serious time, especially to get, these visuals, right? We're just now getting AI that can, sometimes make something that looks, pretty realistic. So this really, really is the segue, and that, I'll just use these, but that like trifecta, right? That intersection of development, of user experience, of UX, right? Designing it. And that third one, which is product design, which is, the product managers knowing what we're doing, why, and who needs what. Okay, the user experience person to really figure out what that user is going to need and how that can, be supported by the tooling that they have, and how they can, think about expanding the tooling they have in a strategic way to, support what they foresee the user needing, right? It's this whole conversation that's always happening. So, anyway, if I'm talking about code, if I'm talking about an organization, if I'm talking about a product, if I'm talking about my kitties, if I'm talking about tokens and DUI, I fundamentally am always going back to the same 4 questions in my head, especially when I sense dissonance. So sense what's going on in your environment versus analyzing it in a logical, structural, way, and one that is applicable to the environment that you're looking at. I'm going to pause. I don't necessarily know where to... Okay, this is where I'm supposed to look right now. It's wild because it's just like this stick webcam. So I'm going to just make that real. I'm going to turn it into a person because typically I've done so many talks with her on Zoom and I get to talk to somebody. If I have to take up my whole screen, I'll typically, at least put myself there so I'm like talking to someone. So yeah, I'm just gonna take a second to make things a little bit more real. I'm gonna turn this into like a stick figure person. Imagine someone there so that I can firstly focus a little bit more this way. So I'm a real person. And come on, guys, as humans, this stuff is very strange to interact with, I think. But I also am very kinesthetic, tactile type of learner, and I like to interact with my environment quite a lot. So thanks for bearing with me in the break, and because I certainly won't be doing any extra editing, I don't believe. So tangent done, or little break done, and now this is a stick person, and I just broke that wall. Okay, cool. So we need to be able to sense our environment, say what's going on, and fix that problem. And sometimes that's energetic. Sometimes it's just something being off or strange. Sometimes it's literal. Sometimes it's a literal broken process. Sometimes it's a literal broken piece of code or just, an error, right? But I think that, wow, there's probably broken code all over the place. That is a consequence of what the real problem is. And the real problem, in my opinion, I think fundamentally, cross lines all the time, is perception or subjectivity or correctly naming the problem, correctly naming what we're working on. And so this is where, like I said, bringing in that like emotional, sensory sense, this research-driven, behavioral observation, contextual inquiry type of observational methods, no matter what you're looking at, no matter what you're working on, because it's helpful and it's a really nice way to problem solve. Because I find that when, if I create a little internal map functional program around it, I like to talk, my brain works a lot in functions, when I'm processing, and if Python's just such an easy way to, make that analogy. I probably will end up doing it now that I've talked about it, but ultimately it's about being able to, sense and perceive and take that and loop that through structural processes so that you're getting objective answers and then analyzing those objective answers against, what you're trying to do. So code, users, whatever, if I sense dissonance, which we're always going to do at the very beginning of a project, but no matter what, I always fundamentally come back to the same little function I've created in my head, at this point, which is, let's see, if I write big enough. So I'm trying to practice writing bigger. I have a tendency to fill up my whiteboard with crazy person, like little writing and diagrams. But this was, I built this so I could do more interactive work on Zoom, and anyway, something I literally need to practice is trying to write bigger, because otherwise I was having to bring my camera up against the wall. So, like I said, this is a live working experiment, and it's fun. I mean, again, people are people, and I think we lose that essence so often. So, anyway, I'm going to practice here. All right, so no matter what, if I'm coding, if I'm, reorganizing my room, if I'm talking with somebody, if I'm, maybe having an argument with anybody, but again, I'm trying to make sure I always hone it back into, I'll hone it back into software for this conversation. It's the 4 W's always. All right, see if I do it. Nope, bigger. Maybe I need a bigger marker. I've got one big marker that's currently working. The other ones we're so old. Okay, so let's try to do it bigger. 4 W's. This is fun. So the 4 W's. We'll figure this out, Megan, over time. 4 W's. This is wild. So the 4 W's. Here, I'll try. Let's try and make this. All right, and I'll get a black one for next time. I don't hate it. All right, so no matter what, I'm going to think through the 4 W's, especially if I'm starting out in a project, or again, if I'm sensing dissonance. Okay, so we've got number 1. Ready, big enough? No, it's just got a crappy glare. All right. Ooh, that works for now. Cool. I can jive with that one. This isn't too bad. Move this. Okay. I think this works for now. 4 W's. So we've got who. We got. Yeah, but now it's not gonna go low enough. We got what. We got where? We got why. Alright. So like I said, I'm not going to try and fit into the camera. I'm going to see how I work. Actually, this works for now. Cool. It's big enough. I swear, look at it. This is the size of my arm. I have to really reorient myself. Okay. So, who, and I might just draw or something to keep my working mind occupied. So who, what, where, and why. Basically, that's always my personal process, and then I loop it through the UX iterative process all of the time. So I am very much in my natural sense a reverse engineer. I don't know, it's just the way that I interact with the world. So I like to first start with trying to define that problem correctly and do it through, as accuracy, and do it through my UX lens. So no matter what, it's like, cool, I absorb that requirement, right? So we're always going to want our requirements. What are the requirements? Okay, so get your requirements. Yeah, cool, great. I'm not going to just take that and run. And that's really easy to do if it's like a small feature or something like that, or a seemingly small feature. Take half an hour. I mean, just run it through. Run it through the cycle. If you're a dev, I get this piece of code. We all have our distinct, responsibilities. So not necessarily questioning like the UX, but let me interpret this. Let me figure out, if I understand as a developer what this thing is doing to a degree. If you don't know who the user is, that's okay. Who's my designer? What are they working through? Can I talk with them? Can I understand how their brain works? Because as a developer, when I'm interpreting this spec that I need to get out there and get working, I want to make sure that I have all the alignment that I can, because even that comes down to setting out the layout correctly or making sure that the right components are being used. And I mean, there's human error that happens. And again, cross-checking each other, supporting each other in the way that we build and what we're choosing. UX and development, and honestly the success of any organization, but any software organization is going to come down to that. So the better that we do it, the better that we can tell that story. And if we want to go on that flip side, that preventative care type of side, once again, it's like if we don't have that understanding and we are dealing with something that's complex, maybe we have a nested token all the way that's down here, for example. It's really similar to this one, or it's just easy to misinterpret. And we have maybe a developer or somebody that's new or tired, maybe somebody's having a bad day, and for whatever reason, right, they pick that wrong one. Just that one wrong thing, can pile up and cause a big issue. If it's one wrong thing can, break an architecture, break an infrastructure. So I would say no matter who you are, come down to always asking these things, even if you're internalized or, trying to figure out a problem with yourself, or that's going on around you. So when it comes down to figuring out naming, first off, I have, when it comes to a startup, naming is a lot easier to deal with, somewhat, because you're not trying to deal with maybe like legacy code, monolith code, or something existing that you also need your changes to ripple back into. On the flip side, if you're in a startup and want to get something out fast, you may or not set your stuff up in a scalable way. You may not have all of the resources available and to help you understand how to do that and scale in the way that you need to, or be able to predict exactly how that's going to need to scale. So once again, no matter what the organization is or who's looking at an issue or a problem or something to take care of, we want to boil it back down to what are we doing, why, and where does this problem exist, okay? So in terms of like tokens, often I'm working at like an enterprise, something very big, and I explained it in, I think part one of my video earlier where I worked at Coupa and was analyzing a gigantic ecosystem, or hopeful ecosystem of products that already existed and that were years and years old, and all sorts of code and architecture. And it's easy to say, I see a bunch of black, I see a bunch of this, I see a bunch of like really similar types of hues, and let's just pick one and roll with it. But especially when you're looking at something that big and the discrepancies I was seeing, 400 colors versus wanting to just roll with 8. Why? So first, I'm not just looking at the tokens or the software. I do this in itself in iterative layers. So in terms of defining tokens or something, and I'm going to speak from, an existing platform at this point or at this moment, it's like, okay, cool. So I'm not just going to look at like tokens. I'm not just going to go in the code and look at it. It's not going to start here. There's probably going to be several of these nodes that I even need to talk to myself. So yeah, this is the main one. Cool. So yeah, this maybe it's like, okay, tokens. So take a look at our code repo, our code library, blah 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 blah. Let's just look at what's here, decipher it, and adjust. That sounds natural. Hopefully not. Okay. Well, if I just audited this, right, and it's like, okay, I went into here and I'm like, who made these? What are these tokens? Where are they? Why are they here? Great, now I've got my answer. Cool. So, like I said, there were, a small number. I'll just say we want to roll with 10 colors, maybe like, I think there were 7 different styles of type, whatever. Before I even knew what to name these, I'm like, okay, cool. Well, we're similar to, I don't want to, let's see, let me throw out some like really large systems. SAP, Lightning, but we're also really similar to consumer-driven UI companies. We had some interfaces that remind, again, I'm just gonna throw out really big, obvious ones that have that like big airy type of feel, if you will, like Material or Uber or something like that. Other ones that have similar feel to like Fluent or Blueprint, things like that. So that was alarming just in its sense, but it's like, okay, you're paying me, I'll do what you want. How do I name this? How do I figure this out? Because I have to figure out, from this sense, it was really obscure. It was like, let's just grab some things out of the air that will make sense as a good example. So like, that would be this. Okay. So like, say that we have like some neutral colors and, blues and reds and whatever. I'm like, okay, cool. So then there's like neutral and dark. I remember, let's see, darkest, light, medium light. And I'll get back to this later when I talk about schemas, because there's a reason and a why, but at this point it's like, in terms of components, we got surfaces, we got borders, we got shadows, we got, a number of text colors, and in terms of componentizing, which again, I can't break down in this moment way too much, but this doesn't work. If I want to change a light surface, but I don't want the light text colors to change, what do I do, right? That's a really, really, micro breakdown of it. So I already knew there was going to be a need for more than this. So what am I going to do? I'm going to go audit. So I'm going to get my requirements. I'm going to be like, cool, what are we dealing with? Like, what are you talking about? I'm not going to take that and roll and just start naming stuff. I got to know what I'm working with, right? So, like I said, this who, what, where, why comes back in consistently. So if we're talking about like a big Python function, basically I've got this as my own Python function that I like take around in my tool belt, and I'm like, great, I'm going to take this and loop this through this area. Great, now I need to look at that area. Now I'm going to loop this same function through this area when I do this step, which is the audit. So in an audit, well, there's a couple major things that you're going to want to do. You're not just auditing what exists, but you're auditing what exists, but more, okay? You're not only auditing your product, okay, and what exists and where it wants to go, where it's going, right? You're also auditing and doing a comparative analysis in a sense, right? I mean, it is that term is so often used. Again, I think I don't hear it as much in engineering or tech or UX. I'll say I hear it a lot more when we're talking about maybe marketing, and especially so when we're talking about like product or sales or something like that. But we need to audit other similar products, right, from many different degrees, to then analyze what we find out and synthesize back into, firstly, our requirements. I got a little, I'm on a scene here, and our environment. Okay. I haven't checked out. Okay, cool. So anyway, so like I said, I'll just throw two out there. I think I looked at 12. These are easy ones. What else did I just say out loud? I'll just throw, these are basic. But not everybody, but these are some big ones that people know, so that'll make it kind of easy. Fluent, I think I mentioned, I'm running out of box room here. I think I mentioned Blueprint. And I think I mentioned, I can't think of the name of Ubers right now, but whatever. So it was a needed to look at what exists, and I needed to look at things out there. I also didn't want to do that in a silo. Again, this is just my process, but if I'm running this function over and over again, right, for every single area that I'm in, it's going to be a lot more work for me to run it through all of this without knowledge of this other, like I said, I see things in like these parallel plateaus. So it's really difficult for me to gain as much understanding. That's what I'm doing here. I'm not just like, marking things down. I can't get as much understanding without also understanding what else is going on out there, especially leading competitors, right? And not only in terms of the features that they offer, but what is underneath. Because everything underneath all of these results, to some sort of architecture, some sort of IA. It's hard to draw on an angle, but hopefully that looks like a schema from that side. But everything comes down to some information architecture of how these key value pairs live together in an ecosystem and can be called in a certain way and then asked to do certain things, if you will. So when I do this audit, in my case, I'm just now in my head, I'm fully in my audit, but let's say like what exists. So I said, I'm just going to ballpark here. I know I looked at something like 400 pages. I know I pulled out of there somewhere around like 400 colors. Can we see? Yes. Okay. And I remember pulling out something like, I just remember a name for typography. And a lot of the typography was in a span. I mentioned that. We have some issues. Ooh, I can use my stickers. So that's not good for... Hopefully we all know about 508 compliance. I'll make a little mental note to do a talk on that as well. But at this point, if you are making a product and if you're not thinking about 508 compliance, I think it's a really big mistake. Whether or not you need it, do it. Just do it. I'll go into a conversation or a discussion about that later. But anyway, especially for something like this, all very, very, very not good. So and again, when it came to naming, and I'm like trying to boil it down to like whatever it was, 8 things, 10 things. I'm like, because here's what I know. This isn't just a mess. Where do I write this? Can we see this here? There is a reason. I know it. Might not be a good one, but there's a reason that is there. And, especially in like these legacy products where we have been, a lot of them have been maybe procuring other softwares or like putting things together, in this startup mode for a long time. Essentially, you're like kind of cutting, pasting, gluing, putting this here, da, 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 da. And like I said, things could even essentially be some mental placeholder of some, a really smart strategic decision or of a designer or a dev that like meant something architecturally, had some semantic or contextual meaning. It was something representative. I don't want to lose that in any way, shape, or form. So when it comes down to defining a naming process, I can't just start in one area and call it good and say we're going to link on to this and roll. Because retroactively, we don't know what that's going to break. And whether or not we're talking of, I guess I'll say, because I leave room for everything. If you don't care if it breaks, great. But everybody else, they probably don't want it to. So you need to understand what your changes are going to do, not only in the future, but retroactively. Because that not only affects your software, what people who work there to be able to work there and to feel joy doing their work and to want to do their work and to want to be innovative and creative, especially when it comes down to something like this. Would you want to live in a city where the people designing the sewer systems and all the, foundation that these very heavy buildings live on, do you want them to do it with care and finesse and, with a thoughtful eye? Or do you want them to be under the gun to just get something done, and then I just keep seeing sinkholes and other things in my mind over time, right? You don't want to build on a broken infrastructure or architecture. So when you are looking at something, yeah, it can look costly, it can look like a time waster, but there's context and meaning to everything. And you can do things quickly. It's just about really value. If you don't see value in something, it's always going to look like a time waster. But if I spend a day or two looking at something and you do see value in it, then it's not a time waster. So again, words, meaning. So when we do an audit, I am not only looking at what's there and who and when, why, and then I'm looking even deeper. So like I said, let's see, where am I at? I can probably erase at this point. I've got 400 pages. Okay, cool. And then those are all connected to a series of products. Okay, cool. And then I'm like, well, how long ago did that product get created? Well, yeah, what did it used to do? Who used to work there? Do any of those designers still work here? Did they create it? Was there, something I ran into a lot, especially early in enterprise? It's like, the disconnect between what we can create as a UX designer and what we know is available out there was a really, really huge gap at the time. And so it's like I used to create meaning in my own mind because I had to reuse so many of the same things, and it was like I'm confusing myself, all to say those in my head were just, internal placeholders for where I could hopefully innovate on this thing later, or I knew this feature was coming and then I'd blend them together, blah, blah, blah. What would happen if I had left? And now that's essentially a placeholder. I call them breadcrumbs a lot. I leave them for myself, so I can make my way back. And that is that is a UX law. I can't remember it verbatim, but I remember, let's see, I can think of a good example in context of like virtual scroll or infinite scroll versus pagination. And in terms of even choosing something like that, it's not just essentially like what looks better type of feature. What is that feature holding? What is the data there? How is the user parsing it? Because in certain contexts, pagination is much better, not only on a server-side rendering, right? We're not just worried about data, but actually users in themselves, the easy one is like chunking, and they leave themselves little mental breadcrumbs based on maybe the last place their mouse was or where they saw this lineup on that page. And so for something that's like really heavy data-driven, maybe where we have like lots of, let me think, like spreadsheets or something like that. So like in supply chain, that idea of infinite scroll actually can cause users a lot of issues because there's no way to have like this mental placeholder, this marker. We do that in our everyday lives with everything that we do. When you, sorry, again, my mind, this ADHD, it's like, I could just go off on, I think, a 20-minute tangent about that. Why do I say all that? Because it wasn't just 88 whatever and 400 pages. That then itself had a cascading series, and at least to me, of all these boxes, of all these different decisions and reasons why somebody made something. And it may not be necessary to pinpoint each and every one, but what is necessary is to try and review it to pick up on big patterns. So I try to iterate through these processes very quickly to find, right, and gauge weight, dissonant weight. Do I find patterns? Is it just illogical naming? Is it just that we didn't have this idea of, structural tokens at the time? Do I sense deeper meaning here? And if I do, I'm going to stop and ask, We have an iterative UX process. That's not dark enough. I already know that. I will button this up pretty soon and maybe do like a part 4, or I can do like a more structured series or a video for at least myself to maybe bullet it out. But sometimes I really feel like there is danger to bulleted lists because then we don't ask what's beyond that. There are really no simple answers to many, many, and most questions. And then at the end of the day, that makes the ability to have a simple answer very simple and easy. Oh man, my recall, that is Occam's Razor's paradox. So anyway, we always have an iterative, oops, I'm not writing big enough again, UX process where we consistently do this investigative and definition of that investigation and then loop back to that bigger process, right? So we kind of investigate. Investigate. Cool. I was about to say good enough, but I just remembered. Might not be good enough. I need to eat something or something else. Investigate. There are a lot of different other excuse me, words, and there are more definitive words. Again, this is my process, so again, I can go through a more definitive UX process. What is the UX process? And I've kind of cultivated my own because I don't like to get trapped in certain types of words or certain definitions or certain thresholds, and even internally with society and our own definition can accidentally do that. So ultimately, you audit, you investigate, you do your research, and then you analyze it, and then you define it, and then you use that definition to move forward to the next part of your bigger process. So what we just started with was, getting our, requirements, if you will, and then, let's see, defining our problem. In a, bigger sense, not the one that we're fully solving yet. So we just defined the problem that we needed naming, and that it's not simple. Okay, so then from there, let's see, UX process, we defined the problem. We know that we need to look, and I know that just by a quick even Google, right, it's going to be not so simple. Went through an audit and all the different parts of, kind of trying to think through an audit, look at all the different areas, collect your information in UX, that's going to be all of your research assets that you can use to define your final recommendation for solving that problem and your final analysis of what you're seeing. So went ahead and audited. Like I said, I audited, I looked at all of those different design systems, and I figured out, I really understand what we need to build. And at that time, and in this example, it was this big, it was a design system that we didn't have. So anyway, you audit, and then you get to, and this is where you get your little cute little dotted line, because this is all of that, cognitive work. This is the cognitive, legwork that sometimes is in a larger organization, more in that PM or researcher area. But like I said, the industry is changing, and it's changing quickly. Those resources aren't always available, and anyway, it's going to be more and more on that designer, which I don't necessarily think is a bad thing, but again, can get into all of that in separate discussion. So why do I say that? Because a lot of people don't see this as work. And that was actually the difficult part of even trying to get through my portfolios. I spent hours and hours and hours and hours, and often on my own time, right, to make sure that I'm defining problems correctly. I can get into a screen share where I go through this actual, I'll just continue this contextually to continue showing what I'm trying to talk about, which is like how deep this stuff can really go. The audit that I did, I can't remember, I have to double check, but I know I spent quite some time on it, gathering content, analyzing, looking at everything in order to really define what we're trying to make. Because what we needed to make was going to cost money from, resource perspective. We want time. We can't just pump this thing out and it's just like this magic, thing. So anyway, all of that is part of the UX process. It is design. It is design work. It is design work. It is design work. It is design work. Then we get into the maybe more physical representation of design. This is where we will maybe iterate something a little bit less verbal and more visual. So I think this is a really great time actually to kind of stop this for my own self. I've been going a while. I'm hungry. I'm thirsty. And I'm afraid if I start talking here, this will go on forever. So this is the first part of the UX process. I've explained how I work through this iterative UX process. And this is the research and definition portion of it. And honestly, any problem you're trying to solve, man, you know what, for a long time I want to be a detective. What do you think they do? Okay, this is how you solve big, big problems and come out with something that you can depend on and flow into for years and years and years and decades to come. Next time we'll get into the actual, so more of that iterative wireframing context or concept of the process. And that is an interesting concept when you are talking something about abstract like tokens. How do you wireframe tokens? So we'll get into what all of that means, wireframing, and then into low, mid, fidelity wireframe all the way to high, and then into great. Okay, now how do we deliver this, spec it out, implement it, and then get back into our QA and this iterative, check up, because the UX process never ends. Once we get past point 6, that thing exists as a live entity, and then after 6, hopefully you check on it again, and you'll go back to 1. Why am I checking on it? And you go through that same process every time. So this does it for me, and talking through, the basic concepts of system architecture, token architecture, and the relationship of systems to naming and our environment and atmosphere, not just in tech, but also in organizations and really in everything around us. So great, I'm going to end this, and you're going to see me do it. So I said recently that it's fortunate, at least let me move this over here, I'm a UX designer because I can be like, make this software oriented, the weird ending part every time, but I'll get used to it. So look, I found music I can use.